Welcome everybody. So we're on the Mem Gimel Amud Beis by the Mishnah, and we finished the Sugyas of Onus and Mufata. Even though it's been a parak before, the parak Elon Naris, and then there was the first Mishnah over here about Narish and Espatata, also had to do with Onus and Mufata. But this now goes into a new subject, and it seems there'll be a variety of subjects maybe in this parak. Here the Mishnah starts about the fact that the father has jurisdiction over his daughter when she's an Ara, and therefore the monies go to him. Yesterday we had the subjects about the earnings and findings that go to the father. A question yesterday was about the brothers, but the father is right to some of the monies that is coming to his daughter. So this mission talks about the ksuba, and the issue is that when he accepts kedushin for his daughter, so that kedushin money goes to the father, which in our translation will mean the ring, or the money that he gives to Mekadesh, the bride. So if she's an Ara, so it goes to the father. That still goes to the father. Doesn't happen to us nowadays because no one gets married before 12 and a half. But in those days that they got married before 12 and a half, so the father would have the rights to Kedushin. And the Gemara is going to talk about the ksuba. That the ksuba, if case he divorces or he dies, and the woman is eligible for ksuba, so who does that money go to? Does it go to the woman or does it go to the father? So the Mishnah says, Amaris is beat over Girsha, Irsa ben Isamala, Ksubasa Shalom. Yisiya Girsha, Yisiya ben Isamala, Ksubasa Shalom. So we know again that there are two stages of marriage. One is called Eris and one is called Nesuin. Nowadays we do everything together. We don't wait in between. We make the giving of the ring is the Kedushin, Erisin, and then right away the Nesuin, which means that he brings her into his domain. But we have either the chuppah or the yichud room, or they go home at night, and that's called the Nesuin. They used to make a big interval between. They used to make a year in between, but nowadays we do everything together. But in those days there was Erison and Nesuin, so the father loses his jurisdiction of his daughter by the Nesuin. Means even before she becomes a Bulgaris, even before she becomes 12 and a half, when she becomes married complete, when the marriage is consummated, he comes. Not I mean dafka consummated that there was a bia, but the fact that she came into his domain, the Nesuin, that's when he loses jurisdiction. That's when she's independent. So here the Mishnah says that if there only was Erison, and Amish knows that there's ksuba from Erison also, even if there only was Erison and he divorced her, or he died, so there's also ksuba, and she's still in the jurisdiction of her father. That's what the Mishnah says. Amaris is beat over Girsha. If a man, his daughter was mu'ureses and she got divorced, or she was mu'ureses and she got widowed, so that ksuba goes to the father. The ksuba goes to the father. The Gemara is going to say that I said that means either or. So the Gemara is going to learn that it means both happened, and the Gemara is going to talk about that. I don't think that the Gemara means that this is the pasuk on the Mishnah, but the Gemara is going to darshan it also as if both of them happened. That he married off his daughter, Erison, and she got divorced. He married her a second time, and she got widowed. Both ksubas go to him because she still is only arusa. She went through two Erisons only, but she's still in the jurisdiction of her father. So the monies of the ksuba go to the father. But if there was an asuin, Yisiya b'Girsha, Yisiya ben Isamala, and so she was in a suah. Once she's in a suah, then she's out of the jurisdiction of the father, and the monies of the ksuba go to herself. Yisiya b'Girsha, or Yisiya ben Isamala. It's another shot. Yisiya b'Girsha, and then then afterwards, Yisiya ben Isamala. Since she was in a suah, so the money goes to herself. Rabbi Yehuda is surely talking about if it happened two times. Not that he's going in the case of the Tanakama, but if there were two times that she was nesua, so only the first one goes to the father. It means I agree to you only the first time around that it goes. I'm sorry. I agree to you on the second time, but the first time, even if there was a nesua, let's say this case over here, see over Girsha. So Rabbi Yehuda still says that ksuba is coming to the father. I think I got it right. Yisiya v'Girsha, even though there was an Nesuin. So Tanakama says once there's an Nesuin, so the ksuba goes to herself. But the Yehuda says no, that this first case, if it happened a second time, Yisiya v'Girsha, and then Yisiya v'Nesamala, so then I agree that it goes to herself because she's already out of the jurisdiction of the father. But the first time, the first ksuba still goes to the father, and that the Gemara is going to explain. Amulo, once it was in a suah, the father has no jurisdiction over her, and therefore the money goes to herself. even if it was the first time. Yisiya, Vigirsha, still she's out of jurisdiction. So what's the difference first time, second time? So just to sum up the Mishnah, the father has the jurisdiction over his daughter until she's a Bulgaris or until she's married, till Nisuin. Amish is not talking about Bulgaris, Amish is talking about the Nisuin part. And therefore, Tanakama says that once she's in Nesua, any monies that come into her for Ksuba go to her. But the Rabbi Yehuda, and if it was by Erison, if the only was Erison, so then she's still in the jurisdiction of the father, and money goes to the father. But once she was in the Nesua, the monies that come into her go to herself. But the Rabbi Yehuda says the first time she was married, and she gets, even though it was a Nesuin, and she got divorced, still the money goes to the father, and that the Gemara have to explain why. The Gemara is at first has a side subject, and the Gemara learns that the Mishnah's case was that both of these things happened. When it says Yisiya of a Girsha, Irsa of a Girsha, Irsa of an Amala, means both things happen. And it's interesting that it changes cases. It talks about a divorce and a death. It could have spoken about 2 times a death. It could have spoken about 2 times a gerushin. Why does it say a case? It wants to say a case that 2 things happened, and it chooses that the first one was a divorce and the second one was a death. Why does it say that? Why does the Mishnah choose such a case? It's a side point. Time of the Yisiya v'Girsha Yisiya v'An Salmona. Avol the Salmona tracing the Yisula Chazil and Suve. The Mishnah, the Gemara says the reason why the Mishnah wants to tell you such a case is because of a side point. Not our subject at all. That there's a question we had about a katlanis. We had this in the Yavamis. Is if a woman's husband, a few husbands died, so then there's a problem that maybe the woman is the cause of their death. Not that she's poisoning them or anything like that, but there might be some issue over there that because of the woman's the skuli of her being married to them causes the husbands to die. So once she's a chazaka, once she's muchzekes katlanis, once she's happened a few times already, so then she's not allowed to marry. She's considered a katlanis, and therefore she's not allowed to marry because it's we're worried that the husband who's going to marry her is going to die. So the fact that the Mishnah said a case about a divorce and then a death, and didn't say 2 deaths in a row, is because we didn't want to talk about a case, even though it has nothing to do with our Mishnah. The Mishnah could have spoken about this case just as well. If the father gets the money, or the daughter gets the wife gets the money, and nothing to do about if she's like get married again. But the Mishnah doesn't want to talk about a case which is a sad case. Rashi says perennials. It's not a regular case that a woman caused the death of 2 of her husbands. So that's what the Gemara is medayik for the reason why the Mishnah says such a case. The reason why the Mishnah says Yisiya of a Girsha, Yisiya of a Salmona, and not a case of both of her husbands dying, is because then she wouldn't be allowed to marry again, and that goes according to one shita. By the way, the Mishnah is just telling you the opinion of Rebbe, who holds that 2 times is a chazaka. According to Hashem ben Gamliel, you need 3 times to make a chazaka, and she still wouldn't be allowed to marry. We paskin as far as the Gemara says, depends by chazaka. Sometimes we go like Rebbe, sometimes we go like Hashem ben Gamliel. As far as this halacha, we're machmir like Rebbe, not to marry a 3rd time after 2 of her husbands died. But I just would like to point out that this is like a drash kind of thing in the Mishnah. It's not the Pashut in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is not talking about if she's allowed to get married again. And also, you might even learn the Mishnah is not talking about that both things happen. Either or happened. And then the Rebbe talks about if she would have gotten married 2 times. But that was, the Gemara does tell us this, at least on a drash level, that the woman who had 2 husbands who died, Rebbe would hold she's not allowed to marry a 3rd time, and that's how we pass it. She's Moslekes Katlanis after 2 times. Now we go a little into the meat of the Mishnah. Rebbe just said that if the first time that she got married, Yisiya, even though there was an Nesuin, again, we're talking about a girl who's not yet a Bulgaris, she's still less than 12 and a half, and she's under the jurisdiction of the father, but she got married, she's in a Nesua, and then the husband divorced her, and Rebbe says that money goes to the father, even though she was in a Nesua. My time of the Rebbe, why should he hold like that? As Rabbanan say, once she's in a Nesua, she's out of the jurisdiction of the father. So why should Rebbe say that the money goes to the father? So the Gemara tries, that the ksuba, even though the ksuba is not paid until the gerish, until the divorce, or until the death, but from the time of the erisin, that's already when the shibud of the seems that the shibud of the ksuba comes, even though it's not paid until eventually he divorces her or he dies. But the erisin is what makes the shibud, and therefore, since at the time of the erisin, she was not yet in the suah, and the father still has jurisdiction. So even though the collection comes later on, he's the one who collects the money. That's how Yehuda holds. Hold Mishas. Let's try to highlight that. We're going to change it soon, but since the Gemara said, Hoil Vishas, the reason of Rabbi Yehuda, My time at Rabbi Yehuda. This is the reason of Rabbi Yehuda. Hoel, Mishas Erison Zocha Ben Av. That from the Erison is the time that the father gets the ksuba, and she's still in a rusa, even though the ksuba was not paid yet. Again, he didn't die yet, he didn't divorce her yet. But since the shibud of the Erison is from the shibud of the ksuba is from the Erison alone, so the father has rights to it, even though the collection time didn't come until after the husband divorced her or died, and she's already in the suah. But he's like has right to it because at the time of the Erison, she still was under his jurisdiction, and therefore he gets the money. That's the pshat that Rabbi Nav Yosef explained Rabbi Yehuda. The Gemara's kasha on this Mosek Rabbi's kasha from a brisa. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Rishana Shalav, like same as our Mishnah, that the first ksuba goes to the father. But here it says, "Amoy Rabbi Yehuda ben Maris es bito kishiktanu bagra v'yachakach says she'en levi rishus ba." That Rabbi Yehuda agrees that if at the time of the nisuin she was already a bogeres, so then the father doesn't have rights to her.
She has her own.
Yeah, but the question is, but as we're saying, you're right, Bulgaria is very independent. But if you're saying that the father has rights to the ksuba since it was from the Shas Erison, by the time of the Erison, she still was a ketana. The father has rights to her, and then she became a Bulgaria and she got the Nisuin. But if you say the reason of Abiyud is because that the father gets the ksuba because the Shas Erison Zacha Ben Av, so Shas Erison she still was a ketana. Why should Rabbi Yehuda be mode over here that the father does not get the ksuba? If you say that the ksuba, the shibud of the ksuba goes to the father because the clock started from the time of the erison, so then this case also, even though she became a garrison between, what's the difference? The father has the right to the ksuba because at the time of the erison she still was a ketana. So that was a mistake. What we said, is not true. We got it wrong. Let's just highlight that. The nupshat hoil uvishus so nichtavin. It doesn't have to do with the erison. It has to do from the time that they write the shtar is the shtar ksuba. So this comes out. The Gemara is pointing out that there's two different stages. Even though we're right that the shibud of the ksuba starts from the erison. Again, the ksuba is collected only by death or by divorce. But when does the shibud come? Someone said my chavrusa said upshat from the name of his chavrusa, that it could be that a ksuba, we look at ksuba a little bit like really he's giving her money right now, but he doesn't pay up until eventually. It means really she deserves a ksuba, like more abasulos, like a dowry. Maybe they would have given the dowry nowadays. Maybe means what the bride brings in, but they would give a present to the bride. But the present is not cashable until there's a divorce, until there's a death. She doesn't need the money right now while she's married. The husband's taking care of her, hopefully. So she doesn't collect the money until the gerushin or until the divorce. But the chiyuv, the present that's given, is already from the shas erison. So first thing, and that's true. And our Mishnah holds that the shibud is from the erison, let's say. But that's not enough that the father should get it. That they don't write the shtar erison until right before the nisuin. Even in those days, even though there was a big difference between the erison and the nisuin, they didn't write the shtar nisuin and the ksuba until right before the nisuin. Before the nisuin. Nowadays, interesting that when do they write the ksuba? Sometimes they write it under the chuppah. That's already after the erison, after the chassan gives the kala the ring. They're already arusa, and then they read the ksuba, and then they make a kinyan, and then they sign it. That means they wrote the shtar ksuba after the erison, before the nisuin. Sometimes they do it before the erison even. They do it earlier. Sometimes they do it. They do it before they go out, before the badek, and they also make a kinyan sometimes, and they sign it over there. So then that means that they even wrote it before the erison. The here the Gemara says that they write the shtar ksuba before the nisuin. So again, the Tanakh and our Mishnah holds that you go according to the time of collection. If at the time of collection she's already nisuah, the father is out.
Yesterday, the day before, we said the time of collection.
Different subject. Different subject. You're talking about Onus and Mufata. We're in a different world, different planet. We changed planets today. You came a little bit afterwards, but this Mishnah is not talking about Onus and Mufata. Now we're talking about a regular ksuba, and the Mishnah said that the father gets the ksuba if she's only in an erison stage, but the woman herself gets the ksuba if she's already in the suah. That's Tanakama. The argument said that even though she was divorced after she was in the suah, still the father gets the ksuba. And we're trying to figure out why. First, the Gemara said because the chiv of the ksuba starts from the erisin, but the Gemara proves that that's not the holds, because he also agrees if she became a bogeres before the nisuin, that the father does not get the ksuba. If it has to do with the erisin, so she was still a ketana at the time of the erisin. Here the Gemara is figuring out holu v'shuso nechtovin. That's the end of the Gemara. Holu v'shuso nechtovin, that the shtar ksuba was written when she was still in his rishus. Means that the time that they write the ksuba is before the nisuin. You can say that, okay, if it's like nowadays, not like nowadays, but they would have erisin, then a year later they would have the nisuin. When would they write the shtar ksuba? Before the nisuin. So Tanakama says, I don't care when they wrote the shtar ksuba, I care when they collect. And still, since when they're collecting, she's already in the nesua, she's out of the jurisdiction of the father, and she gets the money of the ksuba. Now, Abuda holds that if at the time of the writing of the shtar, that's the time that she was still a rusa, she wasn't in the nesua yet. If that's when they write it, they write the shtar ksuba before the nesuin, not at the time of the erisin, almost a year later, but not after the nesuin. They write it before the nesuin. Since at that time she was still not in the nesua, the father has jurisdiction over that. Then Mamela, if she ever gets divorced from that, or the husband dies, so the father has the rights to the ksuba, because at that point she still was an arusa, she wasn't in the nesua. That's the end of the Gemara. I hope that it's understandable. Try to do it just to say it outside now. The Mishnah says that according to Tanakama, the father does not get the ksuba if she was divorced or widowed from the suin. Once she's in the suah, she's out of the jurisdiction of her father, and the monies go to her. So if at the time of the divorce or the death she's already in the suah, she gets the ksuba. Rabbi says no, that this case, he's here for Girsha, even though she's already in the suah, and then she got divorced after the nisuin, and Tanakama says that the father, that she gets the ksuba. Rabbi says no, that the father gets the ksuba. Why is that? The Gemara figures out because you go according to the time of the writing of the shtar of the ksuba, and that was before the nesua. And she was not yet in the nesua. She was not yet in the nesua. Yeah, she was a nara and she was not yet in the nesua, and therefore the father has jurisdiction over that. And even though the money doesn't come in until after he divorces her and she's already in the nesua, still the father has the right to that ksuba. And that's the end of the.
I thought nesua doesn't change anything. Even when she is a nara, because she's still, the father still gets.
No, when it's no, that everybody. Right, and the suin that she's also out of the jurisdiction of the father. That's how the Mishnah ends off that Mishesia ain't lavei v'shuspa. Once she's already in the suah, then the father loses jurisdiction. Rabbi also agrees to that. He just says, you're right. From the nesuah, the father doesn't have rishus, but he has already rights to the ksuba from the time that they wrote it. And the time that they wrote it, it was still rishus. So whole rishus on that the shtar ksuba was written when she was still under his domain. And really, that's the end of the Gemara. I mean, it's the end of the Gemara as far as the Mishnah goes. I'm saying Mashi's Pshat now, and the Gemara is over, and now comes a side Gemara. The rest of the Gemara is going to be like a bonus now, a different point. The Gemara just realized, because of this discussion, that the writing of the ksuba is not the same time as the chiyuv of the ksuba starts. The chiyuv of the ksuba, everybody holds starts from the erisin. From the time of the erisin, that's when the chiyuv of the ksuba is the shibudim start, the shibud starts, but they don't write the ksuba until right before the nisuin. We don't pass like Abu, we pass like the Rabbanan, that as far as the father's jurisdiction, it goes according to when she's going to be divorced or widowed, and then she's in a suah. She doesn't get the ksuba. The father, she gets the ksuba, not the father. But the Gemara is going into a side point now. According to Rashi, the whole Gemara is a side point, and the question is, just to highlight this, mikvah me'emos gavia. So Rashi says the sugi is talking about a regular case of a ksuba that we now know two times. There are two time zones over here. One is the time of the writing of the ksuba, and one is the shas erisin, that when the shiva of the ksuba started. When is there a right to collect from lekuchos? What does collecting lekuchos mean? That when someone has a debt, so then there's a lien on his property, and if he sells it, then the one who has the lien has the right to collect, even if someone would have borrowed money, and then they sold their property. So the creditor has a right to come and collect. You bought a field that there's a lien on it. Like we have a mortgage, there's a lien on it. So if there's a lien on the property, so then even though somebody sold it to you, the seller sold it to you, he didn't have a right to sell it because I have a lien on it if I could collect. So now the question is, there's a lien on the property of somebody that gets married, that he has to pay a ksuba to his wife. And even though he sold his property afterwards, if it comes time to collect the ksuba, the wife could come and say that I got married before you bought this property from my husband, and therefore I'm going to collect. I have a right to collect it. So the question is, when does the lien start? When does the lien start on a ksuba? Is it from the time of the erisin, or is it the time from the writing of the star ksuba? Again, there's a woman who has a ksuba. She has a right to go to the buyers, the lekuchos, that's called, of the properties that her husband sold after the marriage. After the that's the question. After when? After the ksuba. After I have a ksuba, and my ksuba goes before your purchase, and therefore I have a right. I have a lien on these properties. I want to collect them because I didn't get my ksuba. Now the question is, when does the lien of the ksuba start? When does it get activated? Does it get activated from the time of the erisin, or does it get activated from the time that they wrote the shtar, which is before the nesuin, which could be a year difference in between? It was an erisin and Tafshin Pei Beis, and then the husband sold properties during that year, Tafshin Pei Beis, Tafshin Pei Gimel. They got married. There was an nesuin, and that's when he wrote the shtar ksuba, and then eventually he divorced her. Or he died. And now she's coming to collect the ksuba and he has no property. So she goes to the lien and she says to the one who bought it, you bought it after my erisin. But maybe we tell her back, but it was before the shtar was written, before the shtar ksuba. That's the first question. From when does she have a right to collect from the buyers of the properties that the husband might have sold? Because she has, means when does her lien start? Does her lien start on the time from the erisin, which is the time that the ksuba becomes mechuyav, or from the time that they wrote the shtar?
It seems like he
Rabbi just talks about something else. Rabbi is talking about when does the father lose his jurisdiction.
he's saying that it's written.
Right, yeah, but everyone holds that the Mishas Erisin, everybody holds that the Shibud of the Erisin starts, the Shibud of the Ksuba, the Chiv of the Ksuba starts from the Erisin, and therefore, just to point out, if she gets divorced from Erisin, there's already a Chiv Ksuba. Our Mishnah holds that the Chiv Ksuba doesn't come with the Nesuin. The Chiv Ksuba comes from the Erisin, and if they would have gotten divorced before Nesuin, during the Erisin, they decided to get divorced, so she gets Ksuba, because the Chiv of the Ksuba starts from the Erisin already. But it could be that when they write the shtar here, if they wrote the shtar later on, maybe the question will also be, Taisus explains according to Rashi, that maybe there's no right to collect from the Lekuchos from the Erisin. Everybody agrees that the chiyuv of the shibud the chover should start from the Erisin, but there's also the writing of the shtar, and Abuda says that the father, since she was still in Arusa of both of these intervals, but that doesn't go according to the collection. According to the Mishnah is talking about when the father loses his jurisdiction. According to Rabbanan, the jurisdiction has to do getting monies that come in before the Nesuin. But if the money comes in after the Nesuin, that's the Mishnah talking about that the father doesn't get the money. Now we're talking about when does the lien start in order to be able to collect from the Lekuchos. And there shouldn't be told in Rabbi Dan Rabbanan. It should be according to everybody. When does the lien start that the woman could go to the purchasers of those who bought something that she had a lien on? She thinks she has a lien on it because he bought it after the Erisin, but he bought it before the shtar ksuba was written. When does the lien start? That's the most question. Just to put aside the point of Tosefes, we have in the ksuba that is the minimum that Chazal obligated a person to give her ksuba, which means if she's a basula, if she's a virgin, she gets 200 zuz. If she's not a virgin, she's almana or a grusha, so then she gets 100 zuz. That's called the regular mana masayim, either 100 or 200, depending if she's a basula or not. Then there's a thing called tosefta, tosefes. Tosefes means that the husband, of his goodwill, he decides to add on more. He's mechabed his wife, and he gives her a bigger ksuba. If anybody listens to the ksuba, when they read the ksuba, so it says ksufta da, tosefta da, and the dunya dain, there's a tosefes also. The tosefes means that the husband of his own, he adds on more. The regular standard Ashkenazi ksuba, there's masayim zuz for a basula, and then there's also masayim is kukin kesef. That he adds on, that includes also the Nadunya and the Tosefes, but he adds on more as a cooking kesef. Cooking kesef is some kind of Polish coin that's called zakukin. There's a cook. I don't know why they still use the Polish money, but they still use the currency of Poland that they use as cooking kesef.
The question of the kesuvos were from tonight, so I'm right.
Not as a cooking. The chiv ksuba might even be the raisa or the rabbanan, but the words of cooking is how much money we're adding on. Some people, I think,
How much do you think they're adding on? How much are they adding on?
How much are they adding on?
It's rating, seems like they managed to get.
Some write shkolim, some write already shkolim chadashim, some write lira. Lira's also pretty old. So lira's also pretty old. So much.
Guy wrote 20,000 shekels.
It could be that, but that's the regular standard ksuba has is a kukin. But anyway, that's a Polish coin, I think. But the Tosefes just means that the chassan, he adds on to whatever Chazal obligated him. If he wants to, he can add on to Tosefes. It's covered for the bride that the husband says, like, I want you, and I'll $1 million. You know, if I'm going to have a divorce, that's saying how strong he wants to marry her. So now, surely, that only comes from the time that he wrote it, because the Chazal, that's not going to be Mina Erison, because Chazal didn't mechayiv that only till he writes. Then he says, I'm mechayiv myself. So that's not a question that the Tosefes is only from the time that he wrote the shtar. But the question is about the Mana Masayim, that the Mana Masayim that Chazal mechayiv, does that shibud start from the Erison, and therefore there's a lien on any properties that were sold after the Erison, or is that from the Nisuin, from the time that they wrote the shtar ksuba? So that's machlokes. Rav Huna, let's just put the sheetas over here. Rav Huna, one of us Simon Erisin. And Rav Asi argues and says, means there's no question that the Sefes is only Minan Nesuin, but Rav Huna says that the Mana Masayim is from the Erisin, and Rav Asi says no, that the Mana Masayim is also from the time of the Nesuin, which means when they wrote the Shtar Ksuba. Finished Sugya. We're going to come back to the Sugya later on. End of the Gemara, but at this point the Gemara is taking a break. There's a machlokes when the lien of the ksuba starts. Does it start from the Erison or from the time that they wrote the shtar ksuba close to the Nisuin? What?
When is the shtar ksuba?
They wrote the shtar ksuba before the Nisuin.
It doesn't have. It's not.
They didn't do about it. They don't do about Erison. They did about it by the Nisuin. So that's the machlokes. When does the lien start?
How can there's no I thought there's without a star, not you can't take it from the kesuvos. How can take it before they write the star?
How could it be? I think that the fine is asking, how is it possible to elect from the kesuvos before they wrote a shtar? So I think that the fact that they got married, and that is publicized, that's public knowledge that they got married, even though they didn't write the shtar, Chazal obligated the ksuba, so therefore there's a lien on the property. When someone gets married, when you buy something, when you buy property for someone who's married, you have to know that he has a ksuba lien on his property. Even if there was no shtar ksuba written, it could be that the lien starts from the time that he got married. If you know he's a married man, so you know that he has a chiv ksuba. I think that would be the svara.
By Erusin or by Nisuin? By Erusin.
That's the possibility to say that if it starts from the Erison. There are two stadim in the Gemara. Either the lien starts from the Erison, even though they didn't write the shtar yet, or from the time that they wrote the shtar, which is right before the Nisuin. Like the Tefan is asking that we know in all the places you only collect from Meshua Badim, only from a lien, only when there was a shtar written, then it's already publicized, and people and the buyers have a way to know that they should not buy a field that has a lien on it because there's a contract out on this guy. But when it's only a milval pet, if it's only a verbal loan, then how the Lekucha is supposed to know that they shouldn't buy the field? I don't know there's a lien on it. There's no news about it. So I'm suggesting that that's usual by a very regular verbal loan. But here that he got married, even though they didn't write a shtar ksuba, everybody knows that from the time of marriage, there's a chiv ksuba lien that's leaning, that's hovering over him from the time of the Erison. So that would be a tzad to say that you could collect from the time of the Erison. That's the end of that Gemara. It's about 4 lines, and we're going to come back to it towards the end of the sugya. But now the Gemara goes on another subject. The subject is going to be that there's sometimes a person shows that he was mochel. He waived his rights to an earlier shibud. Let's get a little preview of what the Gemara is going to talk about. If someone wrote I'll give an extreme example the Gemara is going to talk about, that someone wrote a contract and then they wrote later on, a later date, the same contract over again. The same contract with a later date. Whatever it might have been a loan or it might have been a sale, whatever it was, a present. He wrote the same contract at a later date. So that's very suspicious, isn't it? That he wrote the same contract with 2 and gave it to him later on. So it could be that nullifies the first one. That if there are 2 contracts with the same date, identical contracts, so the second one maybe negates the first one, and you only go with the first one.
Like that in modern law.
Mhm.
when you have a will, that's, I had this tape from my
Mhm.
mother, she wrote 2 or 3 times.
Mhm. So the later
And
one,
the later one was calm and everything before was.
but you're talking about a case when it's different. It says different. It says something different in it. But first take a case where it's identical.
Then there's not finished, and the last one is, then what's the finish? of the
So there's
last
no
one?
difference, we might ask. There's no difference.
Yeah.
There is a difference because when does the shibud go? When is the lien? Is the lien from the date of the first one or is the lien from the date of the second one? So we're going to say that in some cases, the second one negates the first one. And you only go with the second one, with the later one. Or else they wouldn't have written the second one. To go to the second one, it means that they're coming to negate the first one. So that's what the Gemara is going to talk about, that if there's such a case as negating, so Rav Huna over here says, Masayim and Erison for Tosefes ben Anasuan means he wrote a second one. He wrote the regular shibud is from the time of Erison without writing anything. Later on, before the Nasuan, he also wrote something with Tosefes. And the Gemara thinks to say that why does it not negate the first one? Why should, not because of the first we spoke about when does the shibud chal, but even if the shibud, even if the lien took effect, but if he decided to write a contract and he seems that, and then she accepted it. She accepted this ksuba. So doesn't that mean that she is negating the first one? That's what the Gemara is going to talk about. Maybe the kasha doesn't make sense the way I'm saying it because the Gemara itself is going to differentiate. But first talk about a case where there's an identical contract written at a later date. Sometimes we say that it negates the first one. That's going to be a subject of the Gemara going now. That even if you say that the lien starts from the erison, but by writing a star later on, maybe it negated the shibud, the earlier shibud. That's the Gemara's kasha now. Did Rav Huna say like that? That Masayim and erison. The woman, she got divorced, or she got widowed, that her husband died, and she comes to collect the ksuba, and she has 2 ksubas. She has 2 ksubas. One says 200, like a regular ksuba, and one says 300, a fancy ksuba, added ksuba 300. One is 200, the regular price, and one is 300. So does she have? What does she collect with? Which one does she collect? She has a choice which one she wants to use. We tell her you could use 200, you could 300. You have a right to both of them, but the one of 300 is a later date. So then you can't collect from the lien, only from the later date. If you want to present the first contract, that's 200 from an earlier date, you could, but you're only going to get 200. If you want to, you could present the 300 and you can use that one, but then you're only going to be eligible to get the properties from the later date. So what does the Gemara see from that? Ve'emisa, if it's true, what Rav Huna said, Tikvim Masayim is man rishon, Umeim is man sheni. If you say that the Mana Masayim is from the earlier date, from the erison, and the Tosefes is from the later date that she wrote the ksuba. If Rav Huna divides it, Rav Huna says that you don't have to negate the first one. Rav Huna, by us, didn't say that the first one is negated. He says that the Mana Masayim, the regular chiv of the ksuba, goes from the erison, the earlier date, and the Tosefes is from the later days, from the time that he wrote it. So if so, how come over here we give her a choice? Either you could collect the 200 from the earlier date or 300 from the later date. Let us say that the 200 stays the way it was, and you could collect from the earlier date the 200, and the extra 100. Why not divide the extra 100? The Tosefes. That is right.
Why should she have the option?
Why should she have an option? Because she was given an option.
The one the later date makes perfect.
The later date, it would give her 300, but it would give her less lien. She only has a lien from the later date. If there were properties that the husband had sold between the 2 dates, so if she has a lien from the earlier date, she can collect that also. If she only has a lien from the later date, she can't collect that. So Rav Huna said she has a choice. She has 2 contracts. Both of them are true. The first one is 200 from the earlier date. If she wants to use that, she could. If she wants to use a later one, the bigger one, 300, and she only has a lien from a later date. But the Gemara is asking that if you say that by us that there's a difference between the 100, 200 or the Tosefes, the additional, so then it shouldn't be a contradiction. She should be able to take the 200 from the earlier date, and the extra, the Tosefes, should be from the later date, and we don't have to look at it like either or. That's the Gemara's kasha on Rav Huna.
As if she doesn't battle the original.
Right. The second one doesn't have to be bottled the first one. The Gemara's not talking about bittul. The Gemara's saying, well, it's not a contradiction. It could be Mana Masayim from an earlier date and Tosefes from a later date. Then Misa. That's the Gemara's kasha. And Misa, if it's true, let her get 200 for the first contract and 100 from the later date. But the Gemara says your kasha doesn't make sense. If your kasha will be a kasha, why doesn't she get all 500? Why did he ask only a question of getting 200 plus 100? She has a 200. She doesn't say everything. Why did he say everything? Masayim is man rishon of last me'am is man shein. Let her get both of them. There's 200 from the earlier date, and there's 300 from the later date. Let her get both of them. If there's available from the later date also, let her get 300. Altogether, she should get 500. Why did he say that?
Because you can say, I had no intention of giving you 400 or 500. I had intention of giving you only 300.
Right. That's what the Gemara says. Ella chamesh me'as my time below gavi. How come she doesn't get all 500? Because he didn't write it as a tosefes. He didn't write 200 plus another contract of 300. He wrote this instead of the first one.
Two
Ella,
plus the extra.
Chivin de Lakasa Vlad, he didn't write the following words. Tzvisi vosifas lachlos me'amasayin. Okay, I can't get the last word's coming in also, but the last word doesn't belong there. Hachi. This will be a quotation of the nusach of the document. It would say, I willed, Savisi, I willed, like Tzvi Isri Ban, Masal on the rice, the word Tzvi, we use that word in Akdamas. Savisi means I wished, I willed, and I added on to you 300, on the 200. Means when you want to add on, you have to be specific. He wrote a ksuba of 200. Now he wrote another ksuba later of 300. If he means to say, this whole thing is Tosefes, then he should have written that besides the 200 that I gave you already, I'm adding on another 300. Since he didn't write that, so he's not writing it additional. He's just saying instead of the 200 that I wrote for you, I'm giving you 300. Therefore, he means since he didn't write that, so he means to say the following: that he's saying, I'm giving you a choice. You can keep the first one, and the first one is 200 from an earlier date. I'm giving you also a choice of getting 300, which means that not 300 additional, but 2 plus 1, which is 3, and that you only get from the second one. That's why you don't understand. You don't think that she gets 500. You only gets 300. But now to answer your question, also top of the next page, since he didn't write, I added on to you 100 on the 200. Means what was the question? Keep both of them. We should say that the 200 remains as it was. What was the most kasha? Rafuna says that one of us can be from the older date, and the extra tosefes is from the newer date. So the Gemara said when she had two contracts, one 200 from the old date and one 300 from a new date, the most kasha was keep the 200 from the old date, and only the additional 100 that she should be able to collect only from the older date, from the newer date. Why do you say she has a choice? If you want to get the 300, then you can't get anything only from the later date. That was the Gemara's kasha. The Gemara's answering because he should have written that also. If he meant to do that, then he should have written that I'm adding on to you 100 on the 200. He shouldn't have written a whole new all-inclusive star of 300. He should have written, I gave you 200 already. That's already, leave that the way it is. Leave that the way it is.
That already gave you, that's
Leave
all,
that,
and
leave
now
that.
I'm adding
And also another 100 from a later date. Since
Since
he didn't,
100 addition.
right, since he didn't write that, so he's saying, I'm giving you a choice. If you want 200, then go from the older date. I'm giving you a choice of getting 300. Then it's only from the newer date, and you don't get anything from the older date. So the Gemara explained that that's why Rav Huna says, even though he holds there is such a possibility, you could divide it. You could divide the one of a sign from an older date and Tosefes from a later date. But in his contract, he didn't write that. He would have written that. Since he wrote this way, so he's saying, I'm taking away the Shibud Ayumochel, whatever we'll see soon, that she's waiving the rights that she had from the older date, and she's willing to take 300 all from a later date. And yes.
Ketubah is unique. It's not like we will. Because if it was like a will, none of this would apply. The most recent thing.
Only the later one.
Right, but this recent date.
Because the will is altogether different, because the will only takes effect. How does the will work? The will,
At least the modern day will, it does work. And the last one is.
the last one,
Oh.
because he's showing that
Because
everything
she
before that he
makes-
didn't mean.
Because there might be tikkun in that,
Mhm.
there are differences.
I think it's a big issue with the will. Do they make that take effect after the demise or in his lifetime? Halachically, it's not possible to make a will after the demise because the Torah already said what to do with it. You can't change what the Torah said. When a person makes a will, halachically, then he makes it that he's giving a present that should take effect a few minutes before he dies. He's always saying that the will I'm giving presents out when I'm still alive. If he wants to give a present, he can give it in his lifetime. And he can say, I'm giving the present, it should take effect a few minutes before I die. He doesn't know when he's going to die. But he says it should take effect a few minutes before he dies. It could be something to do with that, about the fact that if he wrote two contradicting ones. I think the Gemara talks about those cases, but I don't remember. The Gemara continues a little bit about this subject about that a later contract negating an earlier contract. Omamar. Iboya Mahai Gavya, Iboya Mahai Gavya. We just finished saying, we didn't say these words, but we said this was the concept that if you had two contracts, Rav Huna said one is 200, one is 300. So he has a choice. The woman has a choice. If it's a woman, or it could be also a loan, or what is it, a sale, whatever he wrote, two different contracts. So a present. So you have a choice. If you want to take the earlier one from the earlier date, and the later one from the later date. But the Gemara says Rav Nachman seems to say different. Lema pliga de Rav Nachman. It seems to argue on Rav Nachman. The Omer Rav Nachman. Shnei stars hayotzim bazach hazeh bitul cheni yasavishon. That if there are two contracts that we see, two different dates, so the second one negates the first one. So what do we have? We have Rav Huna said before that you have a choice. The one who has the two contracts has a choice. You could use the earlier one, but then it's going to be a smaller amount from the earlier date. You can use a later one with a bigger amount from the later date. But Rav Nachman seems to say that in all cases, the second one negates the first one. They only have a right to use the second one, not the first one. That there was one asking, are they arguing? On one hand, Rav Nachman said you have a choice. Rav Huna said you have a choice. Right. Rav Nachman says that the second one negates the first. No choice. The Gemara explains, Lavia Itmar Allah, Amra Papa, Mother Rav Nachman, the Yosef, Beidikla, Latosefes, Kasvei, Achanami, Haosef, Flamidi. Rav Papa explains that Rav Nachman doesn't mean that always the second one negates the first one. It's only if it's mamish identical. If it's mamish identical, that's how I introduced the case before. If you have two contracts, mamish identical, no difference, just the date. So then obviously the second one is coming to negate the first one. And the first one is bottle, he throw in the garbage, only use the second one. Because he didn't mean to do anything by writing the second one besides to negate the first one, because he wrote the same thing over again. But if he made some kind of a tosefes, if he made some addition in the second contract that the first one didn't have, then he didn't negate the first one. And then he's giving you a choice, whichever one you want. You can use the second one, you can use the first one. In this case, that he made 300, the first one was 200. If the second one would have been 200 again, then you're right. Then the second one negates the first one. But if the first one is 200, second one was 300, so he didn't necessarily mean to negate the first one. He meant that I'm giving you a choice. You can use the first one or the second one. Is that good?
But that's only on terms of the amount of money. You might, and the second one, let's just say he says there's a scepter of 1 extra 100, but also you'll have the, you'll have my, you'll have the outhouse in the.
That's like a tosefes. What's the difference if it's 100 or if it's other money, whatever it is, whatever part of the tosefes. If it's something, so that's not a reason to say that it negated the first one. He didn't negate the first one, but he gave a choice. But it doesn't mean you could use both. It means we have three categories now. We have one category where the second one negates the first one. Another category where you have a choice. You can use the first one or the second one, but you can't use both. And then right. And then there's another case where we said that you could actually part of it. You can make it tosefes. You can say that the original one stays strong the way it was, and you can collect the first one from the first date. Whatever's added on in the second contract could be from the later date only, but not that the whole thing is only going to be from the later date. So we have three categories, and that Gemara is going to be a little bit more detailed about what's considered one.
We said the third one.
The Gemara said, okay, so all the three cases already. The first one was we said that sometimes the Manom Masayim will be from the first one, and the additional Tosefes will be from the second one. Then there's a case where he made two shtaros. So then, and he didn't say that I'm being Mosif. If he would have said, if the first one was 200, and then I'll say all three cases. The first case would be that he gave a star of 200. Then later on he said, and I'm giving a Tosefes of another 100. That's the word that he used. Not that he wrote 300. I'm giving you a tosefes of 100. So then it's two separate contracts. The first one is the 200 from the old time, and the extra 100 is from the new time. Nothing to do with each other. Two separate contracts. There's another way that he did it. That he didn't just write plus another 100. He wrote 300. There was an old contract of 200 from an old date, and there's a new contract of 300 from the new date. And it's not a tosefes. It's not saying 500. It's saying 200 from the old date, and he gave another contract 300 of a new date. Then you have a choice. Then you could use you can't use both. And you can't say I want the 200 from the old date and 100 from the new date. Then you have 200 from the old date or 300 from the new date. And then there's a case where you wrote the identical star, didn't do anything extra, and he just wrote a new date. So then definitely he's coming to negate the first one because no other reason why he wrote it. So he negated the first one and he only kicked left from the second date. The Gemara continues a little bit what's considered a tosefes. So far we spoke about there's additional because you have more money. It was 200, now it's 300. That's additional money. Here it also says a case about a dekel, also about dikla, a palm tree, whatever the case. He wrote it. He had and he wrote a piece of property. Then he said also plus the palm tree. plus a decade. So that's also Tosefes. Farm trees a lot of a lot of money. I don't know, but the was going to say other kinds, other ways of also adding on not to the quantity but to the quality. Here's interesting things. If there are two identical contracts that come out of two different dates, the second one negates the first one. Amar Papa, Mother of Nachman, the Yosef Adikla, the Tefes Kasper. We just quoted this a couple of lines ago. Papa says, Rav Nachman only means if it was identical, but if you added on something, a palm tree, whatever it might be, so then you meant to add on. The reason why you wrote the second contract is because of that addition, and therefore it doesn't negate the first one. That Gemara goes on to say a little bit of information what's considered an addition. Pshita Rishon b'mecha or sheni b'matana. Interesting. What if someone wrote? He gave it was a sale, if it might be on a field or on a house, and he wrote the same exact contract, but the whole difference was instead of making it a sale, he made it into a present. Ruvain sold a house in the contract. He said, "I hereby sell you this house," and then he wrote another contract with the same house, same people, but instead of making it in a sale, he made it a present. Is there any more quality? Of course, he doesn't have to pay the money then, but he could have left the first contract and as if he accepted the money. If the mocher is just they didn't have to do anything. He just could have said, "Don't pay me the money." He could have left the contract as it is. What changed in having a contract which is a present instead of a sale? Is there any difference? Does it negate the first one, or
It has to change. It will negate. Has to negate the first one.
why?
Did they already act on the first contract and sell it?
That's what we're talking about. There's a question, let's say, about is there a lien? Means from what time, whatever the case might be. Is the first one negated or is it not? And there's just an extra tosefes over here. If it would have said the house plus the palm tree, that's considered a tosefes, and the first one is valid and the second one is valid. But here he wrote the same thing over again, no more palm tree, but the same house. But the first time was written as a sale, then it's written as a present. So the Gemara says there was a qualitative addition. There's a din of bar metzra, which people who work in real estate are familiar with the din of bar metzra, that when somebody sells a house or a piece of land and somebody buys it, and then the neighbor comes and says, I wanted to buy it. I want to buy it.
And the neighbor.
That's the
should
bar
have
mitzvah.
first choice.
So the neighbor has first rights. So why does he have first rights? Because he tells to the buyer, you only have to buy over here. You couldn't buy someplace else. To me, it makes a big difference. I'm a neighbor. Now I'm going to be able to have two fields next to each other, two houses next to each other. It's much more valuable to me to get this house than to get any other house. But to you, it doesn't make a difference. So
This is after contract.
even after a contract, the neighbor is allowed to take the buyer to court and say that I want to buy it from you for the same price that you want. What?
What you're reading takes. That makes sense.
Why not?
You have a contract.
Yes, but there's a din of not to be cruel. That's how one looks at it. If there's a reason why the buyer wouldn't be able to buy any place else, maybe he says, I couldn't buy any place else. And we'll see soon an example. But if there's no reason why the buyer, that's got to buy over here. There are 10 houses for sale. They're all the same, 10 pieces of land. Let's talk about pieces of land. Maybe it's easier if it's different. Every house is different, maybe. But talk about pieces of land. You have to buy this piece of land. This piece of land to me would have made both of my two pieces of land, my fields would be one big field. Of course, it's much more convenient to have one big field than to have two fields in two separate places. So please sell it to me for the same price that you bought it and go someplace else and buy it. That's called like midas sedom. It's called like being cruel for no reason, just to get at me. That's how the neighbor says, just to bother me. Why can't you buy someplace else? So there's a din that if someone buys a field that's the neighbor would like to buy, so the neighbor could take the buyer to court and demand that he sells it to him. But that's only if you paid for it. But if he got it for a present, then the neighbor can't say, get a present someplace else. No one's willing to give me a present. So there's no din of bar mitzvah by getting a present. If the owner gave it as a present to somebody, so then the neighbor has no rights to force him to sell it to him. I got it for a present. So that's a qualitative improvement that present, the gift has more than the purchase. The purchase would have been contract would have helped him, it helps him. Whatever it's in the second contract helps him to make it into a present. It's considered a qualitative improvement.
He could make, the neighbor could make a claim on the first contract. His original idea was to sell it to you.
So maybe maybe that would be it. If there would be a
It's got validity. Maybe it would turn a lien on, I don't know, in anything that follows.
So the moral of the story is to always give a gift.
if he's not going to give a gift, if he's not going to, he wouldn't give a gift. Why doesn't he want to get the money? The seller.
You give a gift, you validate the contract that you originally wrote, and the neighbor has no right.
Then he has no rights. Does it, if it doesn't negate the first one, so then the first one is still valid, but then he would have a rights to bar mitzvah until the gift. I'm not clear. I don't know. The Gemara says another case, the opposite. What if the first contract was a gift and then he wrote the same exact contract as a sale? Does that affect anything? Is that a qualitative improvement? That's also the Minan Mishum Dina de Balchov who the Kosov came. That when the
This is a will, right?
no wills. This is a sale or a present. No wills over here. So here
I mean,
he wrote a gift and then he changed it in the contract to a sale. Over there, it gives power to the recipient to be able to go back and demand that he wants the money back. If the field is going to be taken away by a balchov, that there's a lien on the field. Someone lent money to the seller, to the giver, before this whole story, 5 years ago. He has a lien on this field, and he sold it or he gave it as a present. So the one who has the lien comes and collects it. He has a right. No difference if it was a sale or if it was a gift. But then the recipient wants to go back to the one who gave it to him or sold it to him and says, you owe me money back because you took away, because my field was taken away. That's only if it was a sale. If it was a sale, then he has a right to say that it was a sale and therefore I gave you money for it, so now you owe me back the money. If it was only a gift, so then the giver could say, it's true, I gave you a gift and then it was taken by my creditor, it was taken away, but I don't owe you anything. So that would be a difference. That would be considered a qualitative improvement in changing the contract from a gift to a sale. Ella, but both of them were exactly identical, both of them were a sale, or both of them were a gift, then there's no difference in the two contracts, and the second one negates the first one. The Gemara goes back. This was a side point, and now the Gemara goes back to where are we by timer? The Gemara said that if they're identical, so then the second one does negate the first one. How could you negate a contract? I mean, if there was a contract that was a good contract, how could you negate it? The case of the ksuba, let's say, whatever it was, the ksuba or the sale or the purchase, how could the second contract negate it? If there was a good contract, it's a good contract. How does it work? What?
That's a very good point.
So that's the most question. My timer. How did he negate it? So it was two ways. Rafa Mamar Ema Uduye Odile. That it's a way of admitting by doing a second contract, both of the parties are admitting that the first one was not true. It was a forgery. It wasn't true. If they made a second contract. So that's saying that they're being molded, they're admitting that the first one is not true. There's another way to look at it. That was Rafram. And Ravacha Amar, that he was mochel, he was waiving the shibud. It means the first one would have been a good shibud, but the recipient, by taking the second contract, is waiving his rights to the first shibud. I would have had a lien from an earlier date, and I really had such a lien, but the fact that I'm accepting the second contract, which is identical contract with a later date, I'm waiving the lien that I had from an earlier date. Not that he's admitting that it was false, it was true, but now I'm waiving it. Two possibilities how to look at the second contract negating the first one. My benayu, is there any difference between these two ways of looking at it? Ike benayu, or ruye sadi, or the shlume peri, or the taska. Three ramifications of this machlokas. The first one is ruye sadi. So Rashi learns that if you say that the first contract was a forgery, so that puts a blemish on the witnesses that were signed in that contract, because now the seller, the buyer are being molded, the husband and wife, they're being molded that the first contract was a forgery. So that shows that the Edom are not kosher. Tais talks about that. How could they make the Edom not kosher? Tais talks about that in whatever's relevant to these people, to the buyer and the seller. If both of them say that the first one was a forgery, so then they cannot use those Edom because they proclaim that those Edom are not kosher witnesses. The ones that are signed in the first contract are not kosher witnesses because they say it was a forgery. If you say he only waived it, so he didn't say that the first one was not true. The first one was a good contract, kosher them, but I waived my rights to the earlier contract. The second one was it was a slummy paying. That does he have to pay back the produce that he benefited from the field? Let's say there was a field that was given identical contract. Both of them were sale. First it was written that it was sold in January. Then it was written that it was sold in February. So if you say that the first one is a forgery, so then if the buyer, the so-called buyer, was eating the produce, the interest, the benefits, the profit from that field from the earlier date, he has to give it back because you're molded that it was a forgery. You didn't buy it at that point; it was still belonged to the seller. And if you say that he's being mochel, means really I have a lien from the January, but I'm waiving my lien from January. I'm only going to keep on to my lien from February, but it doesn't mean that I didn't buy it. I really bought it before. I'm just taking away my lien. So therefore, he wouldn't have to pay back any food. He says that the food was mine. And the third thing is a lataska, which means they say taxes. Who has to pay taxes for that month? That is in the difference in the between the two contracts. If you say that the first one was a forgery, so then it didn't belong to the lokech, it belongs to the mocher, and he'd be the one responsible to pay the taxes. If I see the word taskas like taxes, interesting, taska, taxa, a little different, close by. And if you say that it's not a forgery, he's just waiving the lien that he has, but he did buy it earlier, and the taxes are on him. And the Gemara goes back to the last couple of lines. The Gemara goes back to what we spoke about the beginning of the sugya, which we left it. Let's go back, scroll back. I just wanted to hold on to it. So I said that we'll come back. This little sugya here, from when does the woman have a right to collect? Not the woman. When did the lekuchos? When did they have a right to collect? Did I get it right? When does the woman? I'm sorry, the woman. When does she have a right to collect the lien from the ksuba? Does her lien start from the time of the erisin, or does her lien start from the time of the writing of the ksuba? So we had machlokes, Rav Huna and Rav Asi. Everybody agreed the sefer is only from the time of writing the ksuba, but the question was the manam masayim, does it start from the erisin or from the nesuin times of the writing of the ksuba? We had a machlokes, and now the Gemara goes back to endo apuri paskamai. My habi Allah, the ksuba, what's going to be Allah over there? When does the lien of the ksuba start? So we had only Amaram, Rav Huna and Rav Asi. But Tashma, Dam Avidah Mashmuel, Yisham Abulaz Rav Shimon, Manam Masayim and Eris and Tashavas Minan Nesuin. That he quoted, Shmuel quoted the Machlokes Tanom about it. We only had Amaram, Rav Huna and Rav Asi. But Shmuel quotes Tanom. Abulaz Rav Shimon says, like Rav Huna, that the Manam Masayim is from the Erisin, the Sheba starts from the Erisin, and the Chachamim say no, it starts from the Nesuin like Rav Asi. He passed like Rav Asi, like the Chachamim, that the Sheba of the Ksuba only starts from the Nesuin, even though the Chiyuv of the Ksuba starts from the Erisin, and if he would have divorced her from Erisin, he has to pay her Ksuba. But as far as the lien doesn't go onto that to be able to collect from the Kuchos, only from the Nesuin. Which Taisus asks on Rashi that the Gemara should have spoken about this. That according to this comes out that there is no lien on the ksuba there's a chiyuv ksuba from the Erisin, but there's no lien on the ksuba to be able to collect from the kuchos only from the time of Nisuin, from the time that they write the shtar ksuba. Yasher koach, everybody.
Yasher koach.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So that's the din. Only by the time
Only from the Nisuin that the shibur on the nechasim is